The form was 17 pages long. Page 1 asked for the name of the requesting party. Page 9 asked for the biological classification of the requesting party. Page 14 asked whether the requesting party had ever, in the last 500 years, initiated armed conflict with a neighboring civilization. I filled out all 17 pages in 40 minutes. I have filled out worse forms. I once spent 3 days completing a requisition request for a replacement water filter on a base in a country I am not allowed to name. The filter cost $4. The paperwork cost me 11 hours and 2 pens. The Galactic Compact's Archive Request Form 7 Provisional Delta was, honestly, a pleasure by comparison. My name is Owen Garrett. I am 38 years old. I am originally from a small town in Ohio that has one stoplight and a grain elevator, and a diner that serves the best pie I have ever eaten in my life, or, as it turns out, in any known corner of the galaxy. I served for 12 years in the United States Army. I am now, officially, Earth's cultural liaison to the Galactic Compact, which is a title that was invented specifically for me, because no such title existed before humanity was admitted to the Compact on a provisional basis 14 months ago. My job, as best I can describe it, is to sit in rooms full of beings who find the concept of chairs philosophically troubling and answer questions about human beings. There are a lot of questions. I was seated in the primary consultation chamber of the Compact's administrative station when the Velshara archivist first made the formal request. The chamber was enormous. It could have held a football stadium inside it with room left over for the parking lot. The ceiling was so high that a faint mist had formed near the top, and somewhere up in that mist, lights pulsed in slow rhythms that I had been told represented the Compact's administrative calendar. I had stopped looking up weeks ago. The Velshara were tall. That was the first thing anyone noticed about them. 7 feet minimum, most of them closer to 8, with translucent skin through which you could see, if you looked carefully, the slow movement of bioluminescent fluid that served as their primary communication system. They spoke in words, technically, but the words were a secondary channel. The real conversation happened in the light. The lead archivist was named something I could not pronounce with a human mouth. I called him Arlo. He had stopped correcting me after the 3rd week. Arlo set a data crystal on the table between us. The table was approximately the size of a tennis court, which meant the data crystal was also approximately the size of a tennis court from where I was sitting. The Compact's Academic Verification Council, Arlo said, his skin flickering in calm blues and greens, has been engaged in a dispute regarding the proper classification of the human species within the Compact's standard civilizational taxonomy. Sure enough, I said. The dispute centers on whether humanity meets the criteria for a Class II territorial species, which would place you in the same category as the Draathi and the Ashari collective, or whether a new classification framework is required. What's the new classification called? Arlo's skin shifted. Not blue, not green. Something in the amber range that I had learned, slowly and at some personal cost, meant discomfort. It does not have a name yet, he said. That is part of the problem. I looked at the data crystal. I already knew what they wanted. Arlo had sent a preliminary communication 3 weeks before this meeting. He had been polite about it. He had been thorough. He had used in the preliminary communication the phrase representative sample of human conflict documentation 4 times, and each time he had surrounded it with so many diplomatic qualifications that the phrase nearly disappeared inside them. They wanted war footage. Not simulations, not historical text records, actual documentation, film, archive footage, the real inventory of what human beings had done to each other across centuries of recorded conflict. You've reviewed the preliminary materials, I said. Yes, Arlo's skin went very still, almost no light at all. The academic council reviewed 14 minutes of the preliminary sample before requesting a pause. What did they say about it? They said they needed time for species-wide psychological processing. I let that sit for a moment. 14 minutes. The preliminary sample had been a training video, a peacetime military training exercise from the early 2000s. No shots fired, no casualties, just soldiers running drills in full gear on a cold morning somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, their breath fogging in the air, instructors timing them with stopwatches. No shots fired. 14 minutes, and the academic council of the most advanced civilizational body in the known galaxy needed time for species-wide psychological processing. I picked up my pen. I had brought a pen from home, a plain black ballpoint from a box of 20 that I had bought at a drugstore before leaving Earth. It was the most ordinary object in a room full of impossible things, and I kept it in my shirt pocket like a talisman. I set it on the table, picked it up again, set it down. "You're requesting full archive access," I said. "If you are willing to authorize it." "What's the scope of the request?" Arlo produced a second data crystal. This one contained the formal specification document. I read through it. It covered, in broad terms, documentation from approximately 1914 forward. Both world wars, Korea, Vietnam, the conflicts in the Middle East that had stretched across the first decades of the 21st century, and more recent material, up to and including the current decade. I read it twice. I set the specification document down on the enormous table. Outside the chamber's observation windows, the star the station orbited burned in slow silence, an orange giant that the Velshara had named after one of their ancestral philosophers. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are very large and very far away and cannot hurt you. "Is there a problem with the request?" Arlo asked. His skin was amber again. "No," I said. "You seem hesitant." "I'm thinking." I was not thinking about whether to approve it. I had already decided that. What I was thinking about was the training video. 14 minutes of peacetime drills, soldiers running, instructors with stopwatches. I was thinking about what Arlo's skin would do when he got to 1944. I was thinking about what the academic council's species-wide psychological processing was going to look like when they got past the part where people were just running in a field. I picked up the pen, pulled the authorization form toward me. I signed it. I dated it. I slid it back across the table. "Full archive access approved," I said. "You'll want to schedule the viewing in stages. I'd recommend breaks every 30 minutes. Is the material particularly extensive?" I thought about the honest answer to that question. I thought about all the honest answers. I lined them up in my head like they were standing at attention. "Yeah," I said, "it's extensive." Arlo's skin flickered, a long, slow pulse in a color I did not have a name for yet. "There is one question," he said, "before we conclude." "Go ahead." "The preliminary sample," he said carefully, "the training exercise, the soldiers in the recording." His skin dimmed slightly. "Is it true that you do this to each other?" The room was very quiet. The mist near the ceiling drifted. Outside, the orange giant burned. I thought about the question, not because it was complicated, because it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. "Used to," I said. "Still do sometimes." I put the pen back in my shirt pocket. "That's the math." Arlo was quiet for a long moment. His skin held that color I didn't have a name for. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a flat human sound in a room that had never been designed for human sounds. "I'll be available for the viewing," I said. "You'll want someone there who can answer questions." I did not wait for him to respond. I walked out of the chamber and into the corridor beyond, which was wide enough to drive a truck through and lit in the pale silver that the Velshara used for spaces they considered neutral. My footsteps echoed, just mine. I had signed the form. I knew what was in the archive. I had signed it anyway. Hell of a thing. The conference room the compact had designated for the formal viewing held, at full capacity, representatives from 44 distinct species. I had been given a seat at the front, a small table, a chair that someone had requisitioned specifically for me, which I appreciated. Because the standard compact seating arrangements were designed for beings with either more limbs than I had or a fundamentally different relationship with the concept of sitting. There was a thing on the table that was trying to be a cheese plate. I could not identify the source of the cheese. I did not ask. The head of the viewing committee was a Velshara academic named something I was rendering, privately, as Portia. She had been selected because she was the compact's leading authority on civilizational conflict studies, which meant she had spent 4 decades studying the 3 recorded wars in galactic history and writing papers about them that were considered definitive. 3 wars, 4 decades of study. I had not told her what I thought about that ratio. I had considered it. I had decided against it. The purpose of today's session, Portia announced, her skin cycling through formal patterns of silver and white, is the academic documentation of human conflict methodology for purposes of civilizational classification. Curator Garrett will be available to provide contextual annotation as needed. 44 species turned to look at me. I straightened the pen on the table in front of me. "Ready when you are," I said. The first clip began. It was the Western Front, 1917. Black and white footage, slightly grainy, the way very old film gets when it has been preserved for long enough that the preservation itself becomes part of the image. There was sound. The archive team had done restoration work, cleaned up the audio as best they could, and what came through the chamber's speakers was a low, rhythmic percussion that vibrated at a frequency just below comfortable. The Velshara acoustic team had, I would later learn, described that sound as structurally similar to a dying star, but localized. They were not wrong. On screen, men moved through mud that came up to their knees. They were carrying things, heavy things. Their faces, where you could see them, were blank in the particular way that faces go blank when the alternative is worse. Portia stopped the footage at the 40-second mark. "Curator Garrett," she said. "Yes. Is this the section before the conflict begins?" I straightened the pen. "No," I said. The pen was not crooked. I straightened it anyway. "The conflict is ongoing in this footage," I said. "What you are seeing is standard movement under active conditions." The room was quiet in about 12 different biological registers. I had gotten good at reading the differences. This particular quiet was the one that meant no one was sure what the appropriate response was. Portia's skin held a long, slow amber pulse. Then she restarted the footage. The second clip was Stalingrad. Color-corrected archival footage, the kind that had been digitally restored and enhanced so that the images had a presence to them that black and white didn't. Urban terrain. Buildings that had been buildings and were now something else. Men moving through those buildings, room by room, floor by floor, in a way that required a particular kind of focus I recognized from the inside. The Draathi delegation, seated in the second row, went very still. The Draathi were a formidable civilization. They had developed what the Compact considered the most sophisticated military doctrine in recorded galactic history. They measured conflict in orbital bombardments, clean and efficient, decisive from a distance. Their wars lasted days. They ended when one side's infrastructure was no longer capable of sustaining operations. Then everyone went home. They watched the Stalingrad footage in the kind of stillness that was not calm. It was the stillness of something recalibrating at a fundamental level. A delegate from the Ashari collective stood up. The Ashari were fascinating clinically. They had no pain receptors, not in any functional biological sense. Pain, for them, was a concept that existed in theoretical models and philosophical texts. They understood it the way I understood, theoretically, what it felt like to breathe ammonia. Possible to imagine, impossible to really know. The delegate walked to the exit. The door opened, the door closed. I watched the door for a moment. Then I looked back at the screen. I picked up the pen, set it down, picked it up again. The footage continued. Portia did not stop at this time. I had not told the archive team to edit anything. I had reviewed their selection and flagged nothing. They had asked me, specifically and formally, to flag anything that fell above a certain threshold of intensity, and I had reviewed the full selection and flagged nothing, and they had asked me twice more if I was certain, and I had said yes both times, and they had not asked a third time, which was professional of them. There was no bottom to flag from. That was the honest answer. The archive was what it was, and any clip they had selected was, by definition, representative because the archive was full of representative things, and the only question was which representative things you wanted to start with. I had let them choose. The Draathi were still very still. Around the 30-minute mark, a Velshara academic in the third row made a sound I had not heard before. Not a word, not a formal communication, just a sound that something produces when it is trying to process information that does not fit the existing categories. I straightened the pen on the table. It was not crooked. I straightened it. On screen, the city was still going. A delegate near the back, from a species I was still learning to identify, leaned toward their neighbor and made a low, flickering gesture. Their neighbor responded with a gesture that I had learned meant something in the range of I do not know, I do not know, I do not know. Portia stopped the footage. Curator Garrett, she said, her skin was not amber. It was a color I had not seen on a Velshara before. Pale, almost white, something that looked, if I was reading it right, like shock in a bioluminescent language. Yes. The individuals in the footage, the ones moving through the structures, she paused. They are doing this voluntarily. I thought about the honest answer. I thought about all the layers of the honest answer. The ones who enlisted, the ones who were drafted, the ones who went because there was no other option the world they had been born into gave them. The ones who found, somewhere inside that terrible machinery, something they were good at and could not name and did not know what to do with afterward. It's complicated, I said. Portia waited. Some of them volunteered, I said. Some of them didn't have a choice. Most of them were just doing what the situation required. And the situation, Portia said carefully, required this. I looked at the frozen image on the screen, the ruined city, the men in it. Yeah, I said, for a while. How long did this particular engagement last? Stalingrad, about 5 months. Another one of those room-wide silences. 12 biological registers, all of them saying the same thing in different frequencies. 5 months, Portia repeated. Give or take. In that terrain. Yes. Room by room. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very softly, in a tone that I suspected was not meant to be a formal statement, why did they not simply stop? I picked up the pen, turned it over in my fingers, set it down. They were, I said. Portia's skin went very pale again. Stopping takes time, I said. That's the part that's hard to explain. Starting is fast. Stopping takes time. No one in the room said anything. The frozen image on the screen held its shape. The ruined city, the men, 5 months of room by room folded into a single still frame. Shall I continue? Portia asked. I looked at the cheese plate. I had not touched the cheese plate. I was not going to touch the cheese plate. Yes, I said, continue. The footage resumed. Outside the chamber's observation windows, the stars held their positions, indifferent and enormous. the way stars always are. I straightened the pen. It was not crooked. I kept straightening it anyway. The compact called the recess at the 4-hour mark. Not because the session was scheduled to end. It was scheduled to run 6 hours. They called the recess because Portia stood up in the middle of the third footage block and announced in a voice that was carefully professional and not quite steady that the council required a period of reflection before proceeding. I said that was fine. I said I would be available when they were ready. I took my pen and my untouched cheese plate situation, and I walked out into the corridor. The corridor was cathedral-wide, lit in pale silver neutral tones, long enough that I could not see the end of it. I found a section of wall that was smooth and uninterrupted, and I sat down on the floor with my back against it, because the corridor did not have chairs, and I was tired of standing. I had a granola bar in my jacket pocket. I had started keeping granola bars in my jacket pocket about 2 months into my posting, after I discovered that compact nutritional offerings, while technically sufficient for human metabolic requirements, were not things I was ever going to look forward to. The granola bar was chocolate chip. It was from a box of 18 I had brought from Earth in my personal luggage. I ate the granola bar. The corridor was quiet. Not the 12-register quiet of the viewing chamber, just regular quiet, the kind that happens when you are alone in a very large space and the only sound is your own chewing. I folded the wrapper, corner to corner, then corner to corner again. I had been in this corridor before, not this specific corridor, but this situation, sitting somewhere waiting for other people to finish processing something that I had already processed years ago in a way that I was still not entirely sure counted as processing. 30 minutes in, I heard footsteps. Not Velshara footsteps, which were nearly silent, the result of a foot structure that distributed weight in 7 contact points rather than 2. These were heavier, deliberate, the footsteps of something that had decided to come find me. The being that rounded the corridor bend was Shalvorath. I had worked with the Shalvorath Delegate Corps before. They were the Compact's foremost military theorists, which in practical terms meant they were the beings other civilizations called when they needed to understand why a conflict was happening and how to end it. Their civilization had fought 3 wars in recorded history. The shortest had lasted 9 days. The longest had lasted 11. His name I was rendering as Conrad. He was approximately my height, which was unusual for non-human compact members, with a dense gray hide and eyes that were amber and precise and never stopped moving. He sat down on the floor next to me. This surprised me. The Shalvorath were not generally floor sitters. He set a data pad on the floor between us. The emergency assessment team has completed a preliminary taxonomy, he said, of human conflict methodology. That was fast. We began 3 weeks ago when your archive access was approved. He looked at the data pad. We had anticipated completing a thorough taxonomy before the formal viewing. We believed we had sufficient data from the historical text records. How many frameworks did you identify? 17. He paused. We had believed, based on our modeling of 300 civilizations, that the maximum number of distinct strategic frameworks any sapient species develops for prosecuting intergroup conflict is 5. I finished folding the granola wrapper. It was a very small square now. I kept folding it. We would like you to review the taxonomy for accuracy, Conrad said. He pushed the data pad toward me. I picked it up. I read through it. Conrad waited. He was good at waiting. The Shalvorath were good at waiting. It was one of the things I liked about them. I read the taxonomy twice. I set the data pad back down on the floor. You're missing 4, I said. Conrad was very still. I would have had to look at a Velshara's skin to know what they were feeling. With Conrad, it was all in the stillness, the quality of it. This stillness was not the calm kind. 4 additional frameworks, he said. Yeah. Distinct from the 17 we identified. Distinct enough that they warrant separate categorization, in my opinion. I'm not a military theorist. You can disagree. Could you describe them? I described them. It took about 10 minutes. Conrad did not interrupt. He recorded everything on the data pad and did not ask me to slow down or repeat myself. When I finished, he sat with it for a moment. 21 frameworks, he said. It was not quite a question. At minimum. There's some overlap and some cases where a single engagement used elements of multiple frameworks simultaneously, which makes clean categorization difficult. Conrad looked at the data pad, then he looked at me. Has humanity ever employed all of them simultaneously? He asked. It was a genuine question. He was not being dramatic. He was a military theorist asking a military question in the way military theorists do, which is with the particular calm of someone who has spent their life trying to understand things that reasonable beings would prefer not to think about. I thought about it. I actually thought about it. The question deserved a real answer. Briefly, I said, 44 to 45, hell of a thing. Conrad was quiet for a long time. Then he said, what ended it? I turned the granola wrapper over in my fingers, the small folded square. I had folded it as far as it would go. There was nowhere left to fold. We got tired, I said. Conrad waited. He seemed to understand that there was more. We're very good at getting tired, I said. Almost anything we start, eventually we get tired of. The problem is the eventually part, the gap between when something starts and when we get tired of it. I looked at the corridor ceiling, which was high and pale and silver and completely indifferent. That gap is what causes the trouble. How do you close it? Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you just have to wait for it to close itself. I put the granola wrapper in my jacket pocket. Sometimes someone makes a decision that shortcuts it, ends it faster than the natural trajectory would suggest. I paused. That's rarer, but it happens. Conrad looked at the data pad again, at his 21 frameworks. You are a difficult species to model, he said. I know. Every projection we build, there is a variable we cannot account for. What variable? He was quiet for a moment, amber eyes moving, processing. The point at which you stop, he said. We can model initiation, escalation, tactical adaptation, resource allocation, duration under various conditions. He looked at me. We cannot model the stopping. It does not follow from the other variables in the way it should. I thought about that. No, I said, it doesn't follow, that's the point. What do you mean? If stopping followed logically from the other variables, it would happen sooner. I leaned my head back against the wall. The fact that it doesn't follow logically from anything is what makes it real when it happens. It's not a calculation. It's a choice. And choices don't follow from variables. Conrad looked at the data pad for a long moment. Then he stood up. The committee will be reconvening in 20 minutes, he said. They will want to continue the footage review. I'll be there. He picked up the data pad, stood for a moment in the pale corridor light. Curator Garrett, he said. Yeah. The footage from the second clip, the urban engagement. Stalingrad. The duration, the conditions, he paused, the beings in that footage, the ones moving through the structures. Yes. They were afraid. It was not a question. He was a military theorist. He had watched the footage the same as everyone else. Yes, I said. And they continued anyway. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, not the calculating kind of quiet, something different. That is the variable, he said. He walked away down the corridor. His footsteps faded. I sat on the floor a while longer. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, went back to the viewing chamber. The footage was waiting. I want to be precise about what happened next because there is a version of this story that makes it sound intentional, an act of strategy, something planned. It was not. Someone on the archive preparation team queued the wrong file. I have spoken to the team lead about it since. She is a young woman named Claire who has been with the Compact's documentation division for 3 years and who, when I spoke to her after the incident, looked like someone who had spent 3 days not sleeping and was not sure whether to be horrified or resigned. I told her it was all right. I meant it. The file that got queued instead of the approved historical segment was a folder that had been placed in the wrong directory during the upload process. It was not historical footage. The folder contained documentation from a conflict that had concluded 14 months ago. Current decade, current hardware, current methods, the kind of footage that, unlike the grainy black and white of 1917 or the color-corrected archive of the 1940s, had the flat, high-definition clarity of a recording that was made yesterday. The screen came on. The first image was a landscape. I knew the landscape. My hands went flat on the table in front of me. I recognized the ridgeline, the particular color of the soil, which was a reddish-brown specific to that region and that elevation, the way the vegetation grew in sparse clusters along the lower contours. I had been there. I had stood on that soil. I had looked at that ridgeline from below, from a position I am not going to describe in detail, in circumstances that are also something I am not going to describe in detail. I was not in the footage. The person in the footage was someone else, but they were doing the thing I had done in that place, and they were doing it the same way I had done it, and the gap between watching and remembering was not a gap at all. I did not move. On screen, the engagement unfolded. It was different from the historical footage in one way that I had known, intellectually, would be noticeable, but that watching in this room made suddenly and completely clear. What had required armies in 1944 was being accomplished here by fewer people, with less noise in less time. The scale was entirely different. The architecture of it was entirely different. It was precise where the historical footage was overwhelming, contained where the historical footage was sprawling. The efficiency was not a comfort. I have thought about this since, about why efficiency is not a comfort, and I think the answer is this. Scale, in the historical footage, created a kind of distance. The numbers were so large they became abstract. The landscape was so destroyed it became symbolic. You could hold it at arm's length and call it history. The modern footage did not allow for arm's length. The Dryathi, who had gone still during Stalingrad, had been given the option to leave the chamber during the scheduled recess. Several delegations had taken that option. The Dryathi had stayed. They were watching the screen now with the full, focused attention of beings who understood military operations and were doing the complex internal work of revising their understanding in real time. They did not look away. That was more interesting to me than if they had. The Ashari delegate who had left the room during the Stalingrad footage came back. I noticed that. I noticed it specifically because it meant something. The Ashari had no pain receptors. Suffering was theoretical for them. They had left because something in the historical footage had exceeded the threshold of what their theoretical models could process in real time. They had gone away and processed it. They had come back for the modern footage. They sat down in their original seat. They folded their 4 upper limbs in the arrangement that indicated formal attention. They watched. Portia at the front of the chamber had not stopped the footage. She had realized, I think, within the first 10 seconds that this was not the approved segment. She had looked at me. I was looking at the screen. She had made the decision not to interrupt. I respected that decision. My hands were still flat on the table. On screen, the engagement concluded. The landscape held its shape afterward, the ridge line, the reddish-brown soil, the sparse vegetation. The screen went dark. For a long time, nobody said anything. Then Portia said, carefully, "Curator Garrett, can you confirm the time period of that documentation?" "Current decade," I said, "within the last 2 years." The room processed that. "The individuals we observed," said a Velshara academic from the third row. "Her skin was cycling through colors I did not have names for. The number of individuals conducting that engagement." I knew where this was going. "Yes," I said. "How many?" I told them. 17. 17 people. The Dryathi delegate, who had been still and attentive and professionally composed for the entirety of the viewing session, made a sound, not a word, not a formal communication, just a sound that a being makes when a calculation completes and the result does not match any expected output. Conrad, who was seated with the Shalvoreth delegation, was writing something on his data pad. He did not look up. He wrote for a long time. I looked at the granola wrapper in my jacket pocket. I could feel the edges of it, the small folded square. I took it out, turned it over in my fingers. Portia was looking at me. Her skin was that pale, almost white color again. The one I had come to understand meant that she was past the categories she had available. "Curator Garrett," she said, "is that representative of current human military capability? Not exceptional, not a specialized case. Representative." "Roughly," I said. "Roughly," she repeated. "There are variations, different scales for different situations. What you saw is one approach, one set of conditions. There are others." She was quiet for a moment. "More efficient?" she asked. I thought about the honest answer. "Depends on what you mean by efficient," I said. She did not ask me to elaborate. I think she had decided, professionally and as a matter of personal wellness, not to ask me to elaborate. The Ashari delegate raised their upper right limb, which was the gesture equivalent of a formal question. "Yes," I said. "Curator Garrett," the Ashari delegate said. Their voice was even and precise and entirely without the biological markers of distress that most species displayed in situations like this, because they did not have those markers, because that was not how they were built. "I have a question about the personnel." "Go ahead." "The soldiers conducting the engagement we observed." They paused. "Do they want to do this?" The wrapper was in my fingers. I had folded it as far as it would go 3 hours ago. I turned it over, turned it back. The landscape on the screen was dark now. Gone. Just a dark screen and the reflection of the room in it. I looked at the reflection. 44 species. 1 human. The lights of the chamber overhead. "Some of them," I said. The room was very quiet. "That's not the scary part," I said. Nobody asked me what the scary part was. I put the wrapper back in my pocket. Portia declared a recess. I sat at my table and did not move for a long time, and the room slowly emptied around me, and the dark screen held its reflection, and outside the observation windows the orange giant burned at its comfortable distance, and I thought about a ridge line and reddish-brown soil, and the gap between watching and remembering that is not a gap at all. Claire came to find me about 20 minutes later. She stood at the edge of the chamber, young and exhausted, and she said she was sorry about the wrong file, and I told her it was all right and I meant it. Some things that are accidents are also, in some deep structural way, correct. Hell of a thing. The full assembly of the Galactic Compact had not convened in 300 years. I want you to understand the scale of that. 300 years is a long time for humans. We barely managed to hold a civilization together for 300 years without something collapsing or splitting or burning itself down and starting over. 300 years for the Compact was a medium-length administrative cycle, the kind of gap between major events that historians note as a quiet period. They had convened for a collision between 2 star systems 300 years ago, a natural event that threatened 6 inhabited worlds and required coordinated evacuation. They were convening now for Earth. For us. For the question of what, exactly, to do with a species that had spent its recorded history doing the things that the viewing session had documented, and that had somehow also, in between all of those things, produced philosophy and mathematics and music, and a woman named Claire who felt genuinely terrible about a filing error. The assembly hall was beyond anything I had seen yet in my 14 months with the compact. The viewing chamber had been football stadium large. The assembly hall was the kind of space that had its own weather. There was, near the upper levels, a thin layer of cloud, real cloud, water vapor collecting near the vaulted ceiling and cycling through a microclimate that no one had designed and that had developed on its own over the centuries of the building's use. 400 delegates, plus the observer corps, the academic attendees, the documentation staff. All of them, in one way or another, waiting for me. I had been given 5 minutes. 5 minutes to speak on behalf of 8 billion people and all the centuries behind them. I had not written anything down. I want to explain why. It is not because I was arrogant about my ability to improvise. It is not because I did not take it seriously. I had thought about what to say for the 3 days between the footage incident and the assembly date. I had thought about it the way you think about something that matters, which is constantly and from every angle and never quite to a conclusion. Every time I tried to write it down, what I wrote felt wrong. Not wrong in content, wrong in the way that a prepared speech is wrong for a conversation that is real. I was not speaking to a board. I was not submitting a report. I was standing in a room with 400 beings who had watched what humanity had done to itself and were now waiting for me to explain it in a way that gave them something to work with. You do not prepare for that, you just show up. I walked to the speaker's podium. It had been adjusted for human height, which I noted and appreciated. The adjustment was a small thing. It meant that someone had thought about me as a person standing at a podium, and not as a representative delivering a formal address, and I found that thought useful as I looked out at 400 species worth of faces and skin lights, and amber eyes and upper limb arrangements that indicated formal attention. You want to know if we can stop, I said. No introduction, no context, just that. The assembly was quiet. I know that's the question, I said. You've been professional about it. You framed it as a classification inquiry, a taxonomic matter, and it is those things. But underneath all of those things, what you actually want to know is whether what you saw in that chamber is what we always are, or whether it's one part of what we are. I looked at the Draathi section. We have stopped, I said, hundreds of times. That is also in the archive if the viewing committee got that far. A few delegates made the gestures that indicated active attention. Conrad, in the Shalvorath section, was watching me with those amber eyes. I am going to tell you about some of those times, I said. Not because I want to balance the account, not because I want you to feel better about what you saw, but because if you are going to classify us, you need the whole picture. I told them about the morning after a war ended, not a famous morning. Not one that appeared in history books with a capital letter and a date. A small morning. A town where 2 armies had been fighting for months, and then, on a specific day, the fighting stopped, and the morning after that day, people came out of the places they had been hiding and stood in the street and looked at each other. I told them about a bridge. A famous bridge from a famous moment, where 2 men from opposing sides of a conflict met in the middle of that bridge and shook hands in front of cameras, and the whole world watched. And what was remarkable was not the handshake, but the fact that both men looked like they had not slept in years and did not know what to do with their hands when they were not being used for fighting. I told them about a wall that had divided a city and symbolically a civilization for nearly 30 years. And one night, without military order or political orchestration, ordinary people came to that wall with tools they had brought from their homes, hammers, picks, whatever they had, and they began to take it apart, not because they were ordered to, because they wanted to be the ones who did it. Because after 30 years of the wall, they needed to be the ones who put their own hands on the end of it. We are not a peaceful species, I said. I am not standing here to tell you that. You have seen the documentation. You know the numbers. I am not going to pretend that what you saw was not what it was. I looked at the Ashari delegate. You asked me, I said, whether the soldiers want to do it. The Ashari delegate was still. Some of them, I said. That part is true, and that part is something we are still working on. That is not a solved problem. I will not pretend it is. I looked at Portia, who was seated in the academic observer section, her skin cycling slowly through pale colors. But here is the other part, I said. The part that does not fit your taxonomy and does not fit your models, and that Conrad's team has not been able to account for in their projections. Conrad looked up from his data pad. Every time we have stopped, I said, it has been a choice, not a calculation, not a resource depletion, not a strategic reassessment, a choice, made by people who were capable of continuing and decided not to. I let that sit. The men on that bridge did not shake hands because they ran out of options, I said. The people at that wall did not bring hammers because dismantling it was strategically advantageous. Those things happened because someone, somewhere in the chain of events, made a choice that did not follow logically from the variables. I looked out at 400 species. That is not reassuring, I said. I know it is not reassuring. The fact that our stopping is a choice and not a certainty means you cannot model it. You cannot predict it. You cannot schedule it or count on it. It might not happen when you think it should. I paused. But it does happen, I said. It keeps happening after everything, over and over. Someone makes the choice and it happens. You want a classification for that, I said. You are going to have to build one from scratch. I stepped back from the podium. That's the math, I said. I walked back to my seat. The assembly was quiet for a long time. The microclimate near the ceiling drifted. 400 species in their various registers of silence, processing. Then the vote began. The Velshara voted first, as the presiding civilization. Arlo, who had sat across from me in a tennis court-sized conference room 5 months ago with his amber-colored discomfort and his 17-page form, cast the first vote. Unclassifiable, full membership. The Draathi voted in their block. 6 delegates, each registering individually, each casting the same vote. Unclassifiable, full membership. Conrad voted on behalf of the Shalvorath. He did not look at his data pad when he voted. He looked at me. Unclassifiable, full membership. The Ashari delegate voted. Full membership. The classification field they submitted was 1 line long. Species capable of war and capable of ending it. Both capacities confirmed. No prior category applicable. It was not unanimous. 11 delegations voted for monitored species status. 2 abstained. 1 delegation submitted a formal objection that ran to 12 pages, which I was told was a record for brevity in compact formal proceedings. But it passed. The announcement came in the compact's formal register, in a voice that was designed to be understood by as many biological hearing structures as possible. Earth full membership, classification unclassifiable. The assembly began its formal dissolution. 400 species shifting, rising, making the gestures and sounds and light patterns that corresponded to the end of a proceeding. I sat in my chair for a while. The granola wrapper was in my pocket. I could feel the edges of it. Portia found me before I left. She crossed the assembly floor, moving through the dispersing delegations, and stopped in front of me. Her skin was cycling through soft colors, blues and greens, the calm register. The speech was effective, she said. It was 5 minutes, I said. It was sufficient. I nodded. She was quiet for a moment, not the processing kind of quiet, something else. The footage from the first session, she said. The training exercise, the 14 minutes. Yes, I have been thinking about it since, about why that footage was the one that required the recess, before we had seen any of the others. I waited. It was not the activity itself, she said. The drilling, the movement. Her skin dimmed slightly. It was the faces. I did not say anything. They were not frightened, she said. They were not performing. They were simply present in what they were doing, as if it were ordinary. I looked at the floor, the assembly hall floor, which was a deep dark stone that reflected the chamber lights in slow-moving shapes. It becomes ordinary, I said, with enough repetition. That, she said softly, is what required the recess. I nodded. She stood for a moment longer. Then she said, the soldiers who do not want to do it. I looked up. You said some of them do not want to, she said. That both are true. Yes. What happens to the ones who do not want to? I thought about all the honest answers. I thought about the ones I knew personally. The ones who came home and found that home was a concept that needed rebuilding from the foundation. The ones who sat in rooms and talked to people who were trying their best to help, with varying results. The ones who found something to do with their hands that was not the thing, and slowly, over time, the hands became theirs again. The ones who did not make it to that last part, the ones the math did not work out for. They come home, I said. Portia waited. Her skin was still. We are still working on what that means, I said. She held that for a moment. Then she flickered a slow pattern that I did not have a name for. Not amber, not white, something in between. Something that, if I was reading it right, was the closest thing the Velshara had to acknowledgement of something that did not have a resolution. She walked away. I stood in the assembly hall a while longer, until the last of the delegations had filed out and the space was empty. 400 species, down to one human, standing in a hall that had its own weather. The microclimate near the ceiling drifted, a small cloud, pale and quiet, forming and dissolving in the still air of the ceiling vault. I put my hand in my pocket, found the wrapper, turned it over in my fingers one more time. I did not throw it away. I kept it. I walked out of the hall and into the corridor beyond, which was wide and pale and silver, and long enough that I could not see the end of it. My footsteps echoed. Just mine. Outside, somewhere past all the walls of the station, the orange giant burned at its comfortable distance. Earth was 12 light years away. 8 billion people going about the business of being human, which was complicated and occasionally awful, and also, underneath all of it, something that kept choosing to continue. We were unclassifiable. Full members. Still working on what home meant. Hell of a thing.